Let's talk about localization. You know, this one's been on my list for a while, and I had imaginings of doing something a bit grander on this one. But I've realized that I think this is one that needs to be made because I see so many teams stepping into the same easily avoided potholes. And I think I could just lay out a few broad things to remember and maybe help a few teams not do that. So what is localization then? Localization is the work that is done to get a product, or in this case a game, into another locale, to get it ready to be somewhere else. And in a lot of cases, most of the work is translating it into a different language. But it also includes whatever else is needed for that process, be it changing the educational material, the inserts, getting different age ratings done for different territories, and sometimes doing very deep, invasive work to make a game more appealing to a different region. But let's start with translation. Okay, I'm going to put this up front here, even though I'm not entirely sure this is the right place for it. But if you only take one thing away from this video, take away this. If you are building a game, do not hard code any strings. You should have some form of repository for your strings. It doesn't really matter what it is, as long as there's some place where all the strings can be collected together so that they can be translated as a group. You don't want to have to scrape your data in order to find every single string that was injected into some random field or some little bit of code by a programmer or a designer, because I guarantee you are going to miss some. When I say don't hard code strings, I include the environment as well. It's common to put strings into textures for road signs and like. Don't do that, because even there you probably want the ability to translate them. When I say don't hard code strings, I mean don't hard code anything. So let's talk about some things that are different in different languages. Different languages use different format for dates. Some are year, month, day, some are day, month, year. So if you've hard coded that string construction, then you are going to run into a problem as you localize into a region that does it the other way around. Some languages have different thousand separator. French, for example, uses a period as a thousand separator as opposed to a comma. So if you've hard coded that into your code, you're going to run into a problem when you translate into those languages. Some regions don't actually use 1,000 separators at all. They use 100 separators. I don't know that you need to necessarily worry about that, but it's something to keep in mind. Okay, seamless transition. We are day zero patching this because I reached the point of having started the premiere and then suddenly realized that I had completely forgotten a couple of very important parts of localization. So we'll knit this in and you'll not even notice that it's totally recorded on a different day, weeks later. So as part of translation, let's talk about a couple of different things. First of all, length. Probably if you've ever done translation before, you've been told or encountered the fact that some languages are significantly longer than others, and you need to give yourself enough space to allow for that expansion. This means that any sort of text box where you're going to have a lot of text should have the ability to have a scroll bar, and that's probably not such a huge burden anyway. It removes the restriction on your writing to allow it to be bigger anyway. But then on the rest of your UIs, you need to make sure that you can accommodate different lengths of text. A good rule of thumb is to give yourself at least 50% extra space, but ideally give yourself 100% extra space. For UIs where you're going to have only relatively short things, often very skilled translators can find something that can squeeze into that 50% space if they have to, but they would prefer to have the extra space available. But actually something else about length that isn't always talked about is that you've built your UI with a certain length in mind, and you've accommodated longer strings because I just told you to. But did you consider what shorter strings might look like? A word like sword, which is going to be, 6 characters long in English and somewhere between 4 and 9 characters long in most languages, is just a single character in Chinese, both traditional and simplified. So now you've got something on your UI where it's gone from taking up this much space to taking up that much space, and that might look weird as well. So you do have to think not only about giving yourself enough extra space, but about making sure the UI doesn't look weird when you actually are using up barely any space, so that you can adopt or adapt to that change. One final thing on word length: German and some other languages really like compound words. As a result, you can end up in a situation in German, even though the final translation might actually end up not being as long as the English, where you have a very long word that doesn't fit in the amount of length you've given for a single line. So you do need to be prepared for having word breaks or other things to deal with languages that support very long compound words. Something that we've done, that I've done in the past, is had the font be able to be variable size, so that if you need extra space, it kind of shrinks it down and smushes it in. It's not great. It gets the job done. It means that you can see it and use it. It's not amazing, but if you need to. Also, as long as we're talking font, then you do need to make sure that your cool font that you had specially crafted, specially commissioned just for you, can support all of the different languages that you are planning to support, especially the Unicode languages. Now, often you can kind of get away with just having another full font be your backup and fall back into those fonts if you're translating into Korean or Chinese or Japanese. But you do also need to make sure that you have all the Cyrillic characters, all the accent characters for Russian, for French, for languages that support those things. And as long as you're out in the UIs, don't forget to remember that some of these languages are written right to left, not left to right. Chances are, if you're using any sort of engine, it can handle that, but maybe make sure before you get too far in, and also consider the fact that your alignments and things like that are not going to necessarily be appropriate for those languages, because if you're left justifying, it looks a little weird in a right to left language. I won't talk about dialects. I mean, maybe I will talk about dialects. It used to be that Quebec had a big translation industry for movies, and most of their clients were in France. But eventually, French people decided they didn't really like the translations that were done in Quebec because the dialect was so different. So you do need to take that into account. Potentially, Brazilian Portuguese versus Portugal are definitely different, and Brazil is probably your bigger market of those two. You probably need to do both Quebec and France, though you can usually get away with just doing a French translation and then using it in Quebec. Now we'll seamlessly transition back into the original video. On the surface, translation seems pretty simple, right? These days, you can even go to Google Translate and type in a sentence and get an okay translation into another language. But it's only okay to start with. And this is an instance where there is an awful lot of distance between okay and really something that's any good at all. And additionally, Google Translate tends to have trouble with context. So it can put across the meaning of an individual sentence, but when there is implication or nuance going across many different sentences, that's where it basically can't do that. You need a human who can read your text and then translate with that context in mind in order to try to maintain that. Additionally, a lot of writing contains play on words. Bioware writers are notorious for including puns or wordplay in their dialogue because it makes good writing. But of course, when you go to another language, chances are that wordplay and certainly that pun are unlikely to survive. So what do you do in that case? Well, if you have the tools in place, what you want to do is provide the context again of that wordplay, of that pun, in order to allow the translator to do their best to emulate it or come up with something that maintains that extra bit of specialness that you inserted, as opposed to just filing it away and just just doing a purely literal translation. I know one of the writers, Luke, has had to write long, detailed descriptions of double entendres in order to allow the translators to at least attempt to maintain some of that in the process of translation. And this can be the sign of a good localization organization. If that organization is engaging with you on uncovering the nuance and meaning behind the words, then that's an organization that is going to be engaged in giving you the best quality translation that is possible to be delivered. If, on the other hand, they're just ingesting words and spitting out other words, you'll do better than Google Translate, but you're not getting the quality that is possible to get from a highly engaged organization. In addition to having the strings collected together for ease of translation, you're also going to want some way to identify every string that is displayed in the game. So at BioWare, they use string IDs, which is just a unique numerical identifier for every single string. So when you turn that on, if you were going to display a string that said Tea House, it would instead prepend that with the string ID, and you would get like 93241 Tea House. The reason why you're going to want this ability is to allow your testers two powers. One, to identify the specific string that is wrong, to say string 92383, which I think you mean to refer to the tea house, actually says butter churn, and to also be able to detect strings that haven't been translated or aren't in the database at all. Because what will happen is they're going to turn this on and they're going to play the game with these identifiers enabled. And if they see any string in the game anywhere that doesn't include that string identifier, then they know this is a hard-coded string. This is a very big problem. I better put a bug into the database right away. And then the major issue that you're going to have to deal with if you have a player character whose gender can be controlled by the player is gender. It's interesting because what you'll find is that you don't actually often refer to the player character by their pronouns, because when you're talking to the player, you don't really use their pronouns. You don't say he or she or they when you're talking to the person. So it's only when you're talking about the player character that you're going to need to use those pronouns. But some languages have different verb tenses or different words that are used when talking about that person. So titles, jobs become different based on gender. Actor versus actress is a somewhat out of fashion example from English, but these are much more common in other languages. And some languages, like Thai, have different ways that you speak based upon your gender. So if the player character is male or female, they're going to have different sentence endings based upon their gender. But the good news is, to a large degree, none of this actually matters because the solution is the same in all cases. Basically, you just translate the game for each of the genders you support, and you load the string appropriate to the player's gender. Back on Baldur's Gate 1, when I was implementing this for the first time, we just had two entire string tables and loaded a different table based upon the player's gender. These days, you could probably afford to keep both around, and then that gives you the opportunity to potentially load strings based upon a more specific gender. So if you're on the inventory screen, for example, for a follower, maybe it makes sense to use the gender of the person whose screen you're on. I'm not sure about that, but that's something that you could potentially do if you have both tables loaded. And then if you want to support more than two genders, you're all set up, because 3 is just one more than 2, as long as you didn't do something silly like make your gender a Boolean. Now, if you have multiple player characters that are interacting with each other, this could get complicated very quickly, because you actually have to know the gender of both the speaker and the subject being spoken about, as well as potentially the gender of the subject being spoken to. So you might have to do a lot more translations potentially to handle a male person talking to a female person about a female person, a male person talking to a male person about a male person, and all the different combinations. But if you only have one player character and their gender isn't changing in the middle of a sentence, then it's actually relatively easy to handle. And regardless of how a language treats gender, you solve this problem in the same way by having the translators translate it for each of the genders and then simply loading the appropriate string when it comes time to deal with it. Honestly, thinking about it a bit more, I think that example I gave of this multivariable players talking to other players is an artificial objection, because that would require heavily scripted player-to-player interaction where you are talking to a specific other player. I can't even think of a game that provides that. Even something that has a very complicated bark system like Apex Legends, it's more of a general, I am speaking out to the world. It's not me speaking to specific other characters. So in that case, my gender is the only gender that matters if I'm this person speaking. I'm sure someone can come up with this example, but I honestly cannot think of a single game in which multiple players would need to be recognized as part of the localization process. On the topic of non-binary player characters, it's interesting because my feeling is this is actually a topic that is actually easier than you may think. If you're allowing player gender at all, you've already moved from one to more than one. So don't just use a Boolean and go from one gender to two. Support more than two off the bat. Just do that. And then you just need to accommodate whatever is going on in the region you're translating to with regards to talking about or talking as someone who is non-binary. So I know that Petit Robert just added yel, a non-binary pronoun, to their dictionary, and it seems like the government of France lost their collective minds there. But you're not a French dictionary, so you can definitely just adopt whatever is common usage in the region you're translating to refer to a non-binary character. And they will have adopted rules around verb conjugation or titles or things like that, even in very strongly gendered languages. Once you are handling more than one gender, which you should, because you should allow the player to have some control over the gender of their player, if at all possible. Adding more than one is actually not a lot of additional work. It does mean a pass by the translators. Something needs to be considered, but once it's considered, it's something that can be handled. The one challenge you may run into on the topic of non-binary player characters is that there isn't a full consensus, even in English, about what pronouns are used. So you have they, but you also have she, and there is some disagreement over which are acceptable. I'm not convinced you should fully engage into that discussion. You should probably pick one set of pronouns that you allow for the non-binary characters and move on from there. Though if this is a conversation you are passionate about, then by all means, feel free to engage in that area of discussion. Okay, one last thing on gender. We're getting a little far afield from localization here, but I think as long as we've got the topic open, we might as well hit all of the points. When you are thinking about gender in your game, at least consider how you want to deal with how the player presents. What I mean by that is the player has chosen the gender that they want to be referred to as, and then they have an appearance. So you've got two choices here. You can have what I think Patrick Weeks called the most culturally respectful bad guy, in which case everyone in the entire game automatically immediately knows the player's preferred pronouns and always refers to them by those pronouns. The alternative is you use their appearance or some other presenting gender that the player has chosen to be the gender that other characters refer to them as until they know their actual gender. My default would be to go completely in with most culturally respectful villain. It's the most respectful to the player's wishes, and also it just reduces your complexity immensely. Everyone in the entire universe is aware of that choice and respects that choice. But again, if this is is a conversation you want to have, if this is a topic you want to address, then having the player have a gender as well as a presenting gender might be something that you want to do. Moving beyond simply translation, some of the other things you need to consider for localization are peculiarities about the regions themselves. Some regions have very specific things they disallow for content. I've spoken before about China not allowing corpses or only allowing corpses under very, very restricted circumstances. There's the one that most people have probably heard of with red blood in Germany, which isn't true anymore, but was true for a long time. And then you also have a lot of Middle Eastern countries that simply do not allow any sort of non-cis, non-heterosexual characters at all. So with each of these, you really just need to decide what your response is going to be. For replacing red blood with green blood, probably that's fine. For potentially removing corpses, that could be quite a bit of work, but you might be able to do it, or you might just consider changing the art of your game overall to avoid some of those issues. In my opinion, going to the depth of changing your statements around sexuality is a bridge too far. I don't believe that this is an accommodation that you need to make, nor should you make, in order to simply get into an additional region. But I'm not the person paying your bills, so you have to make that decision for yourself. A relatively famous example of deep localization, which is what this is, when you're going in and actually making changes to the content beyond simply the language, that's called deep localization. A relatively famous example is Crash Bandicoot, which had a very deep localization pass done for Japan, where they actually changed the models of some of the characters in the game in order to be more appealing to the Japanese audience. And it would appear that it actually was successful, because Crash Bandicoot was a lot more successful in Japan than most Western games were being at the time. So deep localization can work if you've got a good partner. I've never been on a game that's done it, and you do need to decide how far you're willing to go, because these sorts of changes can become very expensive very quickly as you are digging around in the content of the game itself in order to accommodate what it likely is going to be a very small minority of your overall sales. Sometimes requests for deep localization can be cultural, sometimes they're about making the game more appealing, sometimes they're legal. Jade Empire had Tibetan prayer wheels, or something that looked an awful lot like Tibetan prayer wheels in one of the levels, and the Chinese distributor wasn't really on board with that. I don't believe we actually did anything to address that issue, but that's an example of something that could come up. In addition to translating the text, you need to decide whether or not you're going to translate your voice acting. This can be tricky because one of the most expensive parts of your story is actually the voice acting. When you're deciding whether or not to translate that, it can be a very expensive decision. Some regions, Germany is an example, often prefer the voice acting to not be translated. They want the subtitles for German and then the voice acting to remain in English. Obviously not universal to everyone in the country of Germany, but it seems to be a relatively widely held belief. And I think the reason for that is that often the voice acting done for German dubs of a game is not great, and they would rather get the best quality of voice acting that they can. On the other hand, in France, you are not going to sell very well unless you do French voice acting. And what's happened, at least in my experience, is that the market, at least for RPGs, seems to be a lot weaker in France than it's historically been. Used to be, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, France was one of the top 3 markets for BioWare games. Now it's way down that list, being beaten even by regions like the Nordic countries, which BioWare doesn't even translate for those countries at all. It simply has an English version in Sweden and Norway and Finland. France is a tricky one because it can be quite expensive to make something that is acceptable for that audience, and even if you do, it may not sell that well. That being said, you do have to be aware of the Toubon law in France, which requires French parity for things being sold in France. So So if you are going to sell in France, you kind of have to do everything. So doing some research for this video, it's starting to look to me like the Toubon law has possibly been blown way out of proportion. Obviously, this is not legal advice, but it's looking like it's not quite as much of a boogeyman as maybe some of the video game publishers treat it. Not legal advice. Do your own research on this one. Just something I noticed. One last thing on localization. I guess it's not technically part of localization, but it's probably worth discussing here in this video is the different build configurations you're going to make. This is mainly about physical discs, which still will make up a relatively large percentage of your sales if you're doing them at all. When you are doing that, you need to decide how your discs are going to be laid out by every single different region. And there are two different competing things that are going on here. The publisher is going to want you to make as few different versions as you can get away with, because that's just simpler from a manufacturing perspective, which probably means they'll want a version for Europe, a version for North America, and then a version for the rest of the world. And then you have all the languages relevant to each of those regions on your disc. Now, if you're doing voice acting for a lot of different languages, that can get really, really big. If you have German and French and English and Spanish VO, well, that European disc is going to be really big. And actually, that North American one is going to be big too, because you're going to include probably French and Spanish and English on that one as well. The other competing factor in the conversation is gray market sales. So something that was done on Dragon Age Origins is we actually did full localization, including voice acting for Russia. The goal there was to try to make a version that could break out in Russia. EA used to have a Russian region manager who was very good at convincing you that this time Russia was going to be huge and the game was going to sell so many copies, and then at the end of the day, it usually wasn't actually true. But one of the things that was happening is that if you shipped a version into Russia that included the other languages on the disc, they were gray marketing those copies back into Europe to sell cheaply, because the versions in Russia were sold at a lower price point to try to compete with the rampant kiosk-based piracy that was going on in Russia at the time. So something to consider when you're building your discs is whether or not you are potentially enabling a gray market by having a version of the game that has all of the languages included in one of the lower cost regions. It still might be worth it just from a logistics simplicity perspective, but it's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about having a region specific build that includes only Russian or includes only simplified Chinese in order to undercut some of the gray market sales that sometimes occur between these different regions. Localization is something that potentially allows you to more than double your sales. Most Bioware games sell more than 50% of their copies outside of North America. And a game like FIFA, it's even bigger. I don't know the actual percentages for FIFA, but I expect it's actually probably well over 50%. So it's something that definitely should be on your radar. There are lots of different companies out there that can help with this. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. And one of the things you're going to want to look for if you're going outside of your organization is someone that is going to be able to provide decent testing in those different regions. It's something that happens very late in your development process, so it can be an extra stressful task added on when you already have enough of those on your plate. But it's still definitely worth doing and considering because of the impact it can have on the reach of your game. But at the end of the day, the number one thing to take away from all of this, more than 20 minutes of content about localization, the number one thing, do not, under any circumstances, hard code any string that is going to be displayed to the player. Not even a debug string, none of it. Put it all in your repository. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources this channel needs to keep running. If you are interested in becoming a member, there's a link down in the description. If you found this video helpful, if it made you interested in localizing some of your own things, please give the video a thumbs up, share it with someone else you think might benefit from it. I will see you again soon. Thank you. Don't hard code strings. Don't hard code strings.